So this time I want to do something a little bit different. This story will not be about the great generals of history and their conquests, but instead I will talk about the other side of war. To be precise, I will talk about refugees. To be more precise, about the German refugees of 1709. Why exactly those refugees at that special moment in history, you ask? Because the German refugee crisis of 1709 is quite comparable to another refugee crisis we know very well, the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015. So in the year 1709, Germany was going through some hard times. In the decades before this story, two big wars were taking place, the 9 Years' War and the War for the Spanish Succession. Both of these wars were absolutely destructive, numerous cities were burned to the ground and the people at the time were going through enormous hardship. As if two big wars in a really short time weren't enough, harsh winters and famines struck continental Europe too. And last but not least, there were massive tensions between the Christian confessions at the time. One region was especially hard hit by all of this, the Palatinates. Now, Great Britain at the time is quite comparable to the situation Europe is in today. Britain was pretty much untouched from all of those wars that were happening at the time. The country itself was quite wealthy in comparison to continental Europe. In general, life in Great Britain was quite good, and as Europe was during the 80s, Britain was quite dependent on immigrants, especially from Germany. Great Britain simply hadn't enough people to populate the colonies as fast as they wanted to. So a German from the Palatinate was told by the colonial government to set up a pamphlet telling the people in his home country to come to Britain and to the colonies. Remember Merkel's remarks about that Syrian refugees were welcome in Europe? Yeah, this pamphlet exploded the same way for Great Britain. So, because of this pamphlet, the situation in their home country, and because they simply didn't see another way out, 11,000 Palatines made themselves on their way and reached Great Britain within months. Now, if thousands of refugees cross the border today, our modern governments can't handle it properly. Yet, imagine the same situation 300 years ago. The initial situation for the Palatines were awful. The authorities had a huge tent city built for the refugees. Children were starving, nobody knew what to do with all those people. The inhabitants of London were absolutely worried. Interestingly, the rich didn't fear the newcomers. They were curious even, and a couple of them donated quite a lot of money for the refugees. On the other hand, the poor people in London at the time, which were quite numerous, were rioting because of this. They feared that the newcomers would push them out and take their places instead. The question everybody had in mind at that time was, what to do with all those Germans? The similarities to today don't stop here. The head of Great Britain was also a woman, Queen Anne. Queen Anne's government was quite sympathetic to the refugees and tried to help them, move them to better places. The Conservatives though didn't like the idea of foreigners, especially Catholic foreigners, moving into their country. Author Daniel Defoe, who was one of the leading voices for the Conservatives, had this to say: "The Palatines are disease-ridden Catholic bandits who eat the bread out of the mouths of our people." Xenophobia and racism was a problem back then as it is today. Well, it turns out fear-mongering is a really good political strategy. So the Conservatives gained power and tried to solve the refugee crisis their way. They split the refugees up in two groups, Protestants and Catholics. Everyone who was a Catholic was sent back to Germany. The rest was split up between Ireland and the colonies in the Americas. The refugees didn't get this for free though, and many of them had to work for years to pay this debt they had to Great Britain. But the action of the government at the time wouldn't stop the influx of refugees. In fact, in the next centuries, the Germans and the Irish would become the biggest minorities in the British colonies. Beginning with the religious conflicts, the famines, the wars, to the female leader of the part in the world that took the refugees up, history can be a good guide for our future, and maybe we can take a thing or two from the German refugee crisis back then. I think we can do better. Subscribe to this video for more stories about humanity and its amazing history.